at the Edinburgh University Debate Union's public event for Edinburgh. My name's Katie. I'm going to be chairing the debate tonight, which is very exciting. So before we get started, there's just a few things to talk through. The first is that we are going to be videoing this debate, done by the lovely Sandhya there. And that means that if you ask questions during the floor debate or make any comments, which I'll talk about in a second, your voice will be on camera. So if you're not comfortable with that, please come and talk to one of us. But we'll keep the camera facing this way so we don't give Sandhya too much to do, so that's fine anyway. Second thing to say, which is very important, is that when we debate, we are not necessarily reflecting our own opinions. Rather, all the speakers here tonight have been put in a position to speak, and so they might agree with what they're saying, and they might not. That's kind of the skill of the game. So please, when you're listening to their speeches, particularly if you feel very impassioned about anything they're saying, direct your criticisms or your comments at what they're saying, rather than the lovely individuals themselves, because they're really nice. So, the format of the debate then, as you can see, we have two speakers on each side. I will introduce you to them in a second. They will each give a 7-minute speech. Following that, we will have a floor debate, so you'll be allowed to make your comments, we'll welcome them, you can ask questions to either team, and then after we've gone through that, these guys, one person from each team, will give a summary as well of the debate that's just gone before that, which should be good. So, the exciting bit is introducing the lovely speakers. In proposition, our first speaker, or the Prime Minister as we'd call him, is Nat. Nat is a third-year linguistics student and a vegetarian, so we're all interested to see why he's not vegan yet. He's been a finalist at many debating tournaments. He's our workshop training coordinator as well, and he's an all-round nice guy. So if you enjoy what Nat has to say tonight, or if you don't enjoy what Nat has to say tonight, but just think it sounds interesting, come along to our workshops. We run them every Monday at 7 p.m. in Appleton Tower, and it'd be lovely to see new faces. Our second speaker on proposition is Anita. Anita's a third-year philosophy and politics student, and she's got a great speaker style and has many debate achievements to prove it. So she's reached the outrounds of competitions across Britain and Ireland. She's a Scottish National Championships finalist, and she's also a quarter-finalist at the European Championships as well, and she's just brilliant, so we really like Anita. On opposition, defending the vegans tonight, we have Dhruti and Mark. We'll start with Dhruti. Dhruti is a second-year sustainable development student, and so is probably the only person actually qualified to say anything in this debate. She represented Edinburgh as a judge at the World University Debating Championships last winter in Mexico, and this year has helped to organise many of our women's socials, and she's also a vegan, so it's very nice to have her. And then finally we have Mark. Mark is a fourth-year IR student. He's reached the quarter-finals of the European Debating Championships with Anita, so it's nice to have some rivalry between them. And he's also one half of the team attending the World University Debating Championships this year in South Africa. He's about to go to his 5th weekend of debating in a row, so let's hope he has something to show. So, before we start the debate, the final thing to do is we can see this as quite a popular topic, and we want to know roughly where the room is standing. So the motion is this House believes that veganism has gone too far. I'll ask you to raise your hand if you support that motion, so if you think veganism has gone too far. Wow, that's well. Good luck, Frog. Okay, I would say that's like 7%. That's right. And for all of us who think veganism has not gone too far, okay, so we're it's going to be interesting. Well, we'll see whether Nat and Anita can change their mind then. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome the Prime Minister, Nat, to open the case that stands in his name. Here he is.
Timer up, bear with me. Yeah, so there's sort of a level of irony today where the two speakers on proposition today, me and Anita, are both vegetarians, and we are probably in the future trying to go vegan. We believe that it's probably, in principle, a good idea, and I think we might, unfortunately, be letting some of you down when you find out we're not actually here to trash talk veganism for half an hour. Rather, we believe that the way that the veganism movement has formed and the way that that public discourse has been shaped is problematic for a number of ways, and we believe that it can and it should do better. So I think we really need to be clear about what we think the veganism movement looks like at the moment. And we think this is problematic in a couple of ways. And we're talking about that. Then I'm going to be talking about what we think the alternative should be, how we think the vegan movement can change structurally to achieve the kind of good benefits that we want. And third of all, I'm going to be talking about some morality, which I appreciate is probably quite difficult to convince people of, but I'm going to have a crack at it anyway and try and weigh up what I think is a big issue in the vegan movement at the moment. Anita will bring you some stuff about the human cost and some other issues there. So let's talk about framing, what we think the veganism movement currently looks like and what we think the issues are. So I think broadly, it's quite hard to disagree that, like, in principle, the vegan movement is like a bad idea, right? I think we can identify that there are issues with the meat industry, with the dairy industry, with the animal consumption industry in general, which we should probably try and solve in some kind of way. However, we think that the issues that lie with the popular vegan movement are twofold. First of all, we think that there is a lack of willingness for a lot of vegans to critically engage with that ideology. I think in the way that I think that the way that goes like this, right? There's like a moral action. I think the way that you look at it, the way I certainly look at it, is you identify an issue in society, and you think of like that being the meat industry, the dairy industry, and you want to find a solution that will hopefully go about solving this, right? I think once you identify quite reasonably that issue as the idea of veganism, that sort of becomes like problem done, right? That becomes box ticked, and you move on from there, living a happy vegan life. However, I think the issue therein lies that you don't go beyond that, right? You don't look for the issues that might lie within the popular, like the discourse, the way that veganism is discussed. I think this has a number of issues in the way that like a lot of individuals go about. I think this results in some quite unfortunate stereotypes about vegans when they're perceived as very like annoying, pushy people. And I think to some extent that stereotype is unjustified, but I also think that like there is some perhaps justification in where that comes from, right? And I think it's not that like it's that you shouldn't try and convince people of your ideology, but I think the way that like that is done specifically in the name of veganism can be problematic for a number of ways. I think it sort of goes through these steps where you believe that you are acting in a moral way and you feel good about it, you feel like you're achieving your moral code, you feel like you are acting in a good way in the world. You go about trying to convince others that this is a moral action. And I think a lot of people don't like to feel that they are acting in an immoral way. They don't like to be told that they are like doing bad things to the world. And I think it becomes very easy for people to be defensive in the face of such harsh derogation. Right? I think it becomes like a lot harder at that point to convince people that they should change their lifestyle, right? And that's like, I think, the first issue. The second issue is the way that the vegan movement gets incorporated into the society that we live in. We live in a society that is inherently capitalist, right? And I think the way that like veganism as like a trend, I think Anita will go on later to talk about how like that trend culture specifically comes back. But I think the way that that trend ends up getting incorporated into capitalist culture in particular is very problematic at the point where it gets like co-opted by big businesses and big corporations who buy into this trend and sell it as a very popular thing that they get to people. I think that has a couple of perhaps positives in terms of availability and like recognition of the movement as a good thing. However, I think the problems are even more so, right? I think this buys into some sort of like, I call it like a sort of liberalism problem, right? Where like people, like businesses like to buy into or like sell the idea that they're very progressive on, say, LGBT rights or on women's issues. But really, because they exist in the same capitalist framework, they are still propping up the root causes of these issues. They are still like propping up the very thing that causes those issues, even if they are selling an ostensibly progressive front, right? So I think at that point that feeds into the lack of willingness to critically engage with the ideology at the point where it is very popular and very just normalised in that specific way, feeds into a capitalist framework. I think it becomes really hard for people to actually change the problematic practices and the negative harms that can occur within from veganism as a result of that, right? Because note that just because something doesn't exploit animals or doesn't come from animal consumption, doesn't mean that it's necessarily environmentally sustainable. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have a human cost as a result of that. Anita will be talking more about the specifics of that in her speech. So I think this is what we mean, right, when we say that veganism's gone too far. Because I think we have to be quite careful when we're not trying to say that you shouldn't be conscious about the way that you consume things, right? But I think the issue as it stands is people don't think about the issues that come out of that. So what we think the alternative should be, we think the movement should probably always fundamentally be anti-capitalist in its scope and in its outlook, right? We think that there is probably a relatively small wing of the vegan movement as it stands, which does have this outlook. I think it's probably quite hard to argue that this is the mainstream, this is the core of the movement. I think, specifically, institutions such as PETA are very problematic in the way they go about dominating the discourse in veganism at the moment, and I think it becomes very hard to achieve the kind of change we want to see when that kind of sort of liberal, liberal kind of veganism is at the forefront of the discourse, right? So I think that organisation has to fundamentally change. I don't mean the organisation PETA. I think that organisation should probably cease to exist. I think the organisation of the veganism movement should fundamentally change to reflect that different outlook that it should have. Moving on to then, I think the biggest problem that underlies a lot of this issue that underlies the vegan movement, I think the biggest issue is, and this is what I'm going to call the PETA problem, right? Where I think there is a unfortunate tendency with that sort of dominance, the dominance PETA has to unfortunately prioritise animal welfare over any kind of benefits that may end up being brought to humans. So when PETA's motto is I don't know what their exam motto is, but saying that we should never under any circumstances experiment on animal lives through the process of animal experimentation. I think if you can produce any kind of material good for human lives through exploitation, even if that exploitation, I think we can still reasonably minimise that exploitation, right? I don't think the trade-off has to be maximal animal exploitation to save human lives. I think we can accept that there will be some level of animal exploitation that we have to go through to make sure that we can provide medication, medical research, that will inevitably save human lives. I think at the point where we're not making saving and preserving human welfare the priority of a human movement, then I think that it's failed and it has gone too far. I also think at the point where any kind of notion of the meat industry being equal to slavery or equivalent to the Holocaust, I think at the point where that gains any traction in the mainstream discourse of that movement, I think it is fair to say that it has gone too far. We'd probably prefer if you do go vegan, but just don't take it too far. Very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech, and invite Dhruti to open the case for side opposition. You're here.
So there's been an immense amount of research and evidence that has gone to prove the various benefits of a vegan lifestyle and veganism under the current status quo. And this is under the domains of environment and sustainability, under the domains of nutrition, and simply put, combating your own cognitive dissonance, in a sense. So through this speech, I'm going to outline the benefits of the vegan movement, illustrate why veganism as a lifestyle is the strongest under the current status quo, elucidate how veganism is becoming a more diverse movement, and how individual responsibility and awareness can easily subdue the few extreme anecdotes that opposition brings to the case today. So, firstly, the three characteristics of a lifestyle activism movement is along the lines of how lifestyle choices are a tactic for social change, how identity is central, and how lifestyle movements diffuse structures inherently. So veganism and the lifestyle activism movement have served as a means for pursuing social change, and veganism is essentially a socio-cultural movement with members who attempt and challenge to dismantle the cultural ritual of meat eating or animal consumption as an unsustainable movement. So by using these characteristics as a launchpad, we can observe how the vegetarian and vegan community have grown dramatically over the last 30 years. And this was previously unheard of for vegetarians about 30 years ago. I mean, just looking at the transition of the number of vegetarians over the last 30 years is a good point to observe how veganism can grow as a movement. And you can see how there are various tipping points in both the movements. Earlier, vegetarianism had an extreme end to itself as well, as veganism is currently going through. So next, veganism's mainstream exposure has certainly benefited from this conscious rebranding. So it is much cooler than it used to be, and this is for the better. It is a lifestyle, a community, a culture, and an ever-growing club where the only price to pay is just being mindful and making a positive change. So this is still important for us to maintain a sense of individualization and research to comprehend why we're turning towards the current vegan movement and to do it properly. And this is very simple for us to obtain, and we still end up having the same benefits than restructuring our entire vegan movement on a whole global scale. So the key issue that we currently face is how veganism might have gone too far, along the lines of how high-income countries have somehow succeeded in constructing a sustainable consumption discourse that embodies their own interests, enabling them to be part of and take leadership in various international frameworks of sustainable environmental governance. So it's like the idea of veganism being coagulated soy protein with textured, pea protein or whatever, but when inherently it's actually lentils, grains, fruits, and vegetables, which is something that many social media contributors are presenting today. So it definitely comes with awareness, recognition, and individualism, which inherently ends up promoting a lifestyle that would help contribute to a better planet. So as climate change, food shortage, and population growth intensifies, we recognize that these issues and prioritize the well-being of our fragile blue planet over cognitive dissonance and a loss of tradition that comes with the meat-eating culture. Like, for instance, what's Christmas without turkey? So animal agriculture is still so under-discussed, and we end up promoting a plant-based lifestyle, which has to be in the forefront of the environmental justice movement, and environmental veganism has to be a movement in itself versus animal rights or health. So it is currently not as prominent as various other social justice movements, like, say, racism or sexism, even though it's deeply ingrained within our own culture, financially and socially. And people don't want to be part of the stigma which would prove otherwise. So earlier, veganism felt like a sacrifice. It may have felt like as though we were losing out on something, but now it's reframed. The current vegan movement has reframed itself in a way that you gain health, you gain a greater sense of living in bound with your values, you gain all the environmental benefits that you wouldn't have gained otherwise. And this sense of empowerment, which the current vegan movement is giving us, definitely ensures that our individualistic stances within the global community contribute to a more sustainable future. So if we look at veganism and futuristic trends within the UK, for example, we see how a potential post-Brexit deal with the US threatening to flood British markets with goods that would otherwise go against EU regulation policies, like, for instance, chlorinated chicken and beef with growth hormones. And we see that this is a strong trigger for people to appeal to a plant-based diet globally without having any issues with diversity. And this receives a substantial spike in the near future. And whether this is a trigger or not, we still see a strong global shift within the way we perceive a sustainable future. And so there are thus no barriers within, there are no barriers which would determine that we have gone too far, thereby making veganism in itself under the status quo uneven. So, a pause.
I'd like to thank Dhruti for his speech and invite Anita to continue the case for side proposition. Hear, hear.
I try to be as vegan as I can, ish. And I'd be very happy if you left the room today being convinced by the fact that veganism is a great thing. And I don't think that myself or Nat disagree with this in any shape or form. We don't believe that it is bad for the environment or for animals or for human beings and our sustainability to pursue veganism. Right? We think that it is probably a better world if each individual were to decide to reduce their animal intake and consumption of animal products. But what we do think, right, is the way that the veganism movement has turned out is that it not only just deters people away from joining the vegan movement or to reduce their intake of animal products, but it only leads to a form of veganism that is unsustainable and does not lead to any of the benefits that the veganism movement wants to get to in the long term. Right? We think that there's a better way of doing this, and it would have been there's a way that this could have happened if veganism hasn't gone to as far a point as it has gone today. Yeah, so that's the veganism is a good thing. But I think that it's quite telling that while Dhruti herself says that veganism has become very mainstream, and pretty much everyone accepts that there are benefits to veganism. Most people accept that there is benefits to not causing widespread animal suffering and water shortages and methane gas and things like that. Most people accept these things as fact, and they know that these things are true. Yet most people aren't vegans. Most people aren't even vegetarians, right? This is still something that is less than 5% of the population. And I think that is quite telling, right? Because if this is something that people person because you're still contributing towards the animal suffering of animals and you're still contributing towards the dairy industry, if you're someone who eats meat, you are someone who favors your own well-being over that of other people, and therefore you are a bad person. This is very much the way that veganism has been framed, and in a way that is very much about more superiority against other people, right? And the way that this plays out is that it means that people who, for example, can't afford veganism because they just simply do not have the time to make vegan products and have to buy fast food, for example, and things like that, are framed as bad human beings because they are not vegans, right? They're framed as people who are selfish human beings rather than people who partake in veganism. People who there are literally vegans who compare people who eat meat as people who are they compare it to things like the Holocaust or things like slavery because they view animal suffering as something that is so large, a harm that is comparable to these things. And I would like to say that probably most people who have any kind of experience of what the Holocaust or slavery is actually will probably disagree with you on that front, right? And it's this kind of extreme view of animal suffering as something that is very much the forefront of what the veganism movement is, in the sense that it's a morally you are a morally ill agent and you are a bad person if you don't 100% fix your actions in a way that is vegan. That makes you a bad person is specifically what turns people away from veganism, right? Because we think that the way that the veganism movement has progressed is that it is very much based on the individual rather than based on collective action, right? So even though Dhruti says that the vegan movement is getting more diverse and it's getting reframed as things health benefits and things like that, we think the harm is already done in the sense that a lot of people are so repulsed by the idea of becoming vegan. Literally, if you slap the word vegan on a product, it's less likely to be sold off and taken off the shelves, right? Because people are so repulsed by the idea of veganism, right? Because the whole idea of veganism exists as a contrast towards your lifestyle and makes people feel bad in a way that doesn't actually enact any change, but only makes them reject veganism as a philosophy, right? Because if you are told that if you are not a perfect vegan and you ever eat bacon or you ever drink, I don't know, chocolate milk or anything of the sort, and do anything that isn't 100% vegan, you are actively causing harm and actively causing suffering, and therefore you are a morally bad person. Most people don't like to think of themselves as a morally bad person, and I think it is safe to say that we don't actually think that we are all bad people because we are not perfect human beings and we don't perfectly subscribe to veganism, right? And it is that kind of moral superiority that alienates people so much from veganism as a movement and from veganism as an alternative or as a lifestyle choice that they can engage in, right? Which makes people completely reject veganism and yeah. We think that given that, right, this kind of creates a dichotomy where it's almost if you are vegan, you are a great human being and you are doing things perfectly, and if you are not vegan, even if you're just vegetarian, that's not enough. you are still contributing to suffering and things like that. We think that like this kind of framing is very harmful, and this is why we think that veganism has gone too far. Because insofar as like we are trying to reduce things like animal suffering and reduce things like water shortages and like factory farming and all of these kind of practices, we think that it's probably beneficial that instead of trying to enact this kind of like strict like veganism, what is probably beneficial is if we make more people become flexitarians, or to just reduce their meat intake and to like do things like have like meatless Mondays and things of the sort, which means that the amount of animal like suffering and like resource that like we like lose because of animal products significantly decreases, and we're able to better reach the kind of like outcomes that vegans want in the first place, right? We think that like this is specifically why veganism has gone too far. And also, like the way that veganism plays out today is also one which very much is like a trend following, right? In the sense that it's like veganism in a way that is unsustainable, right? Because people would prefer that you like eat avocados and like almonds and quinoa to anything that is remotely like related to animal products, even though these are things that are not necessarily sustainable or good for animals or good for human beings, right? Like the amount of water that it takes to grow almonds, the fact that avocados are usually like grown through blood cartels and things like that, the fact that quinoa like ruins local economies and things like that. We think that a veganism that is focused on collective and on corporates and hold corporations to account rather than individuals and makes people repulsed by veganism as a movement is much better veganism.
I'd like to thank Anita for that speech and invite Mark to continue the case for side opposition. Here, here.
I think in a rather radical way, the government bench has failed to defend the motion set before them. Because their burden wasn't to claim that veganism was not as nice as we would otherwise like it to be, or that veganism is an ideology that exists with at least some flaws. Their burden was to claim that veganism in some sort of fundamental way but failed to fulfill the burdens and obligations set out for it as a movement. I think on net, veganism has been an incredibly and tremendously positive force in the world, and it's a movement and organization that we all respect. And most of the criticisms that the government bench have leveled against veganism as a movement are indicative of almost all political or ideological movements, and I think those are aspects of it which actually, in many cases, serve to enhance and strengthen the ability of veganism as a movement to achieve productively the outcomes that it sets for itself. Because it's very unclear to me what the alternative they want for veganism is. Because they say a lot of things in their speeches that they would prefer were characteristics that were different about veganism. They say, well, they want a veganism that makes people feel less defensive, doesn't attack their personhood or their identities or their ability to make individual choices. But simultaneously, they say they want a veganism that is willing to criticize in an anti-capitalist way the entire economic system in which we live. It strikes me if we adopt the policy of being more structurally opposed to the meat industry, to opposing not just the meat industry or the dairy industry, but industry period or capitalism period, that's a stance that's going to make an even larger number of people feel less defensive. So it's unclear to me what specifically it is that they think they're defending. But also a position which is more anti-capitalist is presumably a version of veganism that has gone further than the veganism that we have now. So their burden isn't just to say veganism ought to be different in some way. Their burden is to say veganism ought to be more moderate and therefore less far than it is right now. Saying you want veganism that is more anti-capitalist is a veganism that is further than the veganism that we have in the status quo. They say the problem with veganism is that people in the vegan movement are unwilling to criticize the ideology or the basic assumptions of their beliefs. I think this is true of every belief system that has ever existed. Everyone who belongs to an ideology or a set of beliefs or understandings is going to exist in some sort of echo chamber, and there are always going to be people in the echo chamber who act either irresponsibly, condemning people in unreasonable ways, making comparisons to the Holocaust. There will always be people in movements who choose to do that. I don't think that's a problem that's unique to veganism, and it's unclear to me that there can be a different kind of veganism where individual members of that movement don't behave in ways that are harmful. I think in the vast majority of instances, individual vegans are like nice people whose respect for animals doesn't come to the exclusion of their respect for humans and are willing to behave in ways that are considerate towards those people. I think the characterization Anita gives you, where the vegan movement as a whole is willing to condemn people universally who do not agree with the belief system they have, is just a false and incorrect conception of what the movement is doing. And I think it's the idea of the movement that's been built up by a media that's opposed that movement, rather than the responsibility of vegans themselves or the responsibility of the veganism movement, that is the consequence of that perception. I think it's the fact that we perceive veganism that way is because of the way that the media is preconditioned to exclude it, rather than the fact that veganism is actually the organization doing something wrong in that instance. What I want to highlight to you is the severity of the problems veganism is seeking to solve. Right? The issue of climate change represents an existential threat to our ability to live a decent and meaningful life, to our survival on this planet. The meat industry claims the lives and dignity of millions of animals every year. And so a problem that severe requires a movement that is willing to take a strong stance in order to be able to counter an evil that is truly terrible. I think that justifies a relatively extreme amount of rhetoric, because I think comparisons to outright condemnations of that system are reasonable when the system itself is doing things that are incredibly and terribly harmful. I think the reason people are defensive towards veganism as a movement is because the fundamental claim of veganism is to say that the actions and diets that you have are morally wrong. And I think those diets probably are morally wrong. I think there's a version of veganism where you would simultaneously claim that people ought to be adopting different diets, and that the basis for that is a moral claim about the dignity of animals or the way that's negatively affecting climate change, and people wouldn't respond in a negative way to that claim because you're being challenged on your beliefs and your lifestyle. So I think it's reasonable that people respond in that way, yes, but it's also impossible to construct a vegan movement that isn't going to make people feel that way. Because I think we're justified in making people feel defensive when they're doing things that are wrong. So if you buy the premise that the vegan movement is challenging a just and real evil, right, that the meat industry globally has terrible negative consequences for the environment, then it's reasonable that people feel defensive in response to this. But also I think this balances out a lot of the claims they're making about animal testing and the harms that occur there to humans. I think there might be some subset of policies that veganism adopts that might be net harmful to humans. But I think the overall, the outcomes that veganism is trying to push for are good, not just because they benefit animals, but because they protect the ability of humans to live on this planet in a meaningful and dignified way. In terms of being able to get more people on board with the vegan movement, because this is Anita's claim, right? That the way that veganism goes about itself and is effective in convincing individuals of your position, especially when your position is tied to a moral absolute, like the idea that animals deserve a fundamental base amount of dignity and that we all grant that to them. I don't think being compromising on that is an effective way of making that argument. Well, what I think is more important here is that you're better able to shift the window of what people consider normal in terms of their diets when you are willing to engage in a more extreme stance. Because the way that you change people's minds is by shifting their perception of what normal is. That's why Trump is so successful, right? Because he introduces into politics an ideology that is very radical, is very divergent from people's experiences, and that grabs a lot of attention, so it's successful in the media. But critically also, he makes, by comparison, previously very radical Republican stances look incredibly moderate. So I think the reason why people are way more willing to accept vegetarianism right now is because you're comparing it to a veganism that is more extreme. And so suddenly vegetarianism, which previously was considered a radical and extreme ideology, like in the 80s, very few people were vegetarians. Now that becomes much more reasonable because you have people who are willing to take a more aggressive and more harsh stance. And so, on net, more people are willing to become vegetarians by virtue of veganism becoming more extreme. I think that's incredibly valuable because clearly we have a government bench that believes people ought to be vegans. So I think, by comparison, veganism is doing just fine in the status quo in achieving that outcome.
Well, that marks the end of part one. The exciting thing is now you guys get to have your say. So for about 10 minutes or so, I will be asking if anyone has any comments. As I say, please remember that the views of our speakers do not necessarily reflect what they said, so be kind with your comments. And you can direct them to either side, questions, thoughts, feelings, how your day was, just like you just shared with us. So, do we have any questions at all? Yes, hi.
Hi, Nat, I think one of the last points that you made was about the argument for testing on animals if it was to save human lives. But I think looking at it realistically, that's a false dichotomy of hurting animals or human beings are safe, because there's no guarantee that continuing to test on hundreds of millions of animals a year will definitely result in cures. And the animal model already is coming under a lot of scrutiny. There's lots of people saying that it's not an accurate way to get information that's relevant to humans. And also in the past, animal testing has resulted in deaths and deformities in humans, like thalidomide was found to be a successful drug in animals, and then obviously it caused lots of birth deformities. And then Vioxx as well, that was found to be successful in rodents and then caused 27,000 human heart attacks. And so there's no guarantee that it will actually help. So it's almost like you're comparing an action of hurting animals and saying that's better than an inaction of looking at alternatives. And it would be a different argument if there weren't realistic alternatives that could work. But there are, like in vitro testing and simulations and human skin grafts and stuff. I'm not a biologist. I don't really know what the actual terms are. But I think that argument only works if it was proven that animal testing definitely is the best way to go. And there's organisations that have come out and said that even when animal testing has resulted in human advances in science, in the past when there weren't alternatives, there's no guarantee now that those discoveries couldn't have been made without animals.
Are we responding now, or are we doing it as speeches?
Mark, what would you like to?
We'll play it by ear. Do you feel like responding? Respond. If you you can duck out of that challenge if you want.
You had a thing about like the medication stuff, right?
Wait, so what was the precise question?
It was like animal testing is probably not an effective way of actually achieving the cures that you want.
I guess that's kind of almost irrelevant in the sense that, like, even if that were true, that wouldn't change the way that our current practices are and the current, like, regulations that exist, right? So, like, even if it were true that, like, animal testing isn't 100% effective and things like that, like, the way that, like, drug patenting and, like, things like that work is,
It's the FDA approved,
yeah, like,
right?
it requires an improvement that requires an animal testing process, right? And I think it would take a lot more to undo that entire process than to...
You have a laptop with facts, we don't.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, like.
Thank you very much. That's a great comment. Yes, we have one over
I
here.
just want to clarify an argument. Just for the opposition, did you just try to say that like veganism wasn't too far by calling veganism an extremist radical movement?
If I use that wording, I use that wording incorrectly. The intention of my argument was to say, I don't think the position that veganism takes right now is radical relative to the problems that veganism is seeking to solve, because the nature and scope of those problems is so existential to like both the human and animal experience that it seems reasonable that we take a stance that is rhetorically more extreme. I also think like extreme relative to presumably whatever it is that government want us to defend, because presumably a veganism that is going to further than whatever they want is slightly more extreme on that spectrum. I think a slightly stronger stance, which I think is the wording I probably should have used as opposed to extreme, a slightly stronger stance in favor of veganism, a more principled stance in terms of veganism, I think is effective for shifting discourse in a way that a moderate stance isn't.
Thank you.
Is that my apologies if that was unclear.
Well, do we have any other comments? If you've got one, raise it high so I can see you. No? Hi, yes.
Yeah, so you mentioned that people are repulsed if they see something branded as vegan, although nowadays lots of supermarkets actually have to brand what is vegan. So are you saying that if someone saw a pasta that previously didn't have a vegan logo on it, now when it's got the vegan logo on it, pasta's always been vegan, they would like not buy it through like repulsion because it says it's vegan?
I think that sort of I think usually the way that plays out is there's like a tiny little like green V on the back,
Yeah,
something like that, right?
that's
So it's not like it's being branded as like vegan pasta. I think the difference is people seeing stuff like aggressively branded like vegan alternatives to meat, like vegan
cheese.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff that is like it is specifically branded as being a vegan product as an alternative to something that's usually not a vegan product. I think that's where people are sort of it's good. Obviously, I think it's probably good those alternatives exist, but I think that is the kind of like branding that is like to some people. I think that's kind of what we do.
So where did you get information that people were repulsed by it?
Did you have a source for
I should be clear, so in debating, it's more about the perception rather than like a statistic.
We don't have,
So
like,
it's
labels.
perfectly reasonable for them to say it is possible that some people may feel repulsed, but you get to decide how convincing you found that.
Repulse is probably a strong word. I think more just like less likely to buy it. I think like call that repulsion. Maybe some people, but probably that's not like the majority perception. But yeah,
Like a lot of people would view products that are labeled specifically as vegan as things that are for vegans, right? So like if you're someone who was just trying to like shop around, like you're less likely to buy something that is very much branded as something that is for vegans if you're not yourself a vegan. If that makes sense?
Perfect. Any other? That made more comments happen. How exciting. Yes, at the back there.
I would have thought it's probably the opposite actually about the vegan logo and the marketing, because as we know, supermarkets are actually quite good at doing their business. That's why they are what they are. And as the fair trade, when it first started, raised sales to the roof because it became like a kind of a thing that everybody wanted to follow. And I personally don't think actually supermarkets would actually put it there if they thought that it would decrease sales. I think they know that the vegan products or anything that's marked vegan sells quite well these days because of whether it's more trendy or whether it's more health conscious or whatever. And I think that's one of the reasons why actually supermarkets it's become to be on so many different products that they actually put the vegan logo. So I think it probably does the opposite actually. It increases sales.
I've got a response to the sub speech, so I'll just leave.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That was a great comment. I should ask, does anyone have a comment for the opposition bench? Yes. Hello. What is your comment?
Hit me.
So opposition has told us that in addition to the human benefits, it's also good to reduce animal suffering as a part of the vegan movement. Gov has made the claim that some degree of animal suffering is alright if there's some benefits, like the factuality of this, I guess is up for debate. But in the world where that is true, do you see animal suffering, do you think the vegan movement ought to see animal suffering as the same as human suffering, or do you agree there could be some trade-off?
I mean, I'm not sure those are mutually exclusive as like ideas of morality, right? Like presumably being a vegan means you don't disregard the suffering that humans experience. I just think in most of the cases where we're willing to instrumentalize animal suffering for the purpose of human benefit, we're not making a trade-off where we're trying to prevent detrimental harms to humans, or we're very willing to justify our behavior ideologically on the basis that we might be benefiting humans, when in reality that's not necessarily true. So I think theoretically, yes, you might be willing to make a trade-off between animal rights and human rights. But in the same way that you'd be willing to make a trade-off between human rights and human rights when you're imposing moral systems, right? Both of those forms of suffering are valid, both those consequences are valid. I just think most of the times when you're saying, with the reason we're imposing suffering on humans, the reason we're doing animal testing, the reason why we have to farm so that we can have access to meat is to facilitate an aversion of human suffering. Most of the times when you do that, I think those arguments are ideological rather than that that's the actual case, that's the trade-off that you're making.
I'll take comments for anyone again now. There's the hand before. Where did it go? Oh, this is sad. Yes, hello. Oh, wait, actually, sorry, one sec. Do you want to go for it? We just got a new comment.
Okay.
Yeah.
No. So I'm sure you were referencing something called the open window, when it's like you can making veganism really extreme and like really acceptable, then you can convince the moderates to kind of like it's like a reasonable. There's like the range of reasonable ideas, opinions, but the flip side to that is that you antagonize the opposition even more. So it's like you're polarizing the system in that case. So you're going to have, yes, moderates who become perhaps vegetarians, but you're completely antagonizing the other side. So do you think it might be sensible to have two kinds of movements, one vegan movement, and then perhaps a movement where meat eaters who don't believe in the sort of industry, the
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think the reality is, right, like we're having a debate about what the vegan movement believes, but the reality is it's got lots of very diverse people in it, and obviously that's going to be different, or your experience of that movement is going to be different depending on who you are, or what like particular part of the vegan movement exists. So I think what you're describing sort of does exist to a certain extent. I think also it kind of exists in the existence of more moderate versions of veganism, which I guess would be vegetarianism. Right? There's also different diets that exist on a spectrum between just being a full carnivore and being a vegan. With regards to sort of polarizing an opposition, I think it's a little unclear what that we're concerned a mobilized or radicalized group of people who are meat eaters are going to do that's worse. Right? So I think what people who aren't aware of the consequence of their diet are doing in the status quo is to eat lots of meat. I don't think people respond to this by eating lots more meat. I think they might respond to this by being more angry. But I don't think this means that their diet is going to contain. Like, you're not like, oh, I'm going to eat like.
You met toxic
To be
masculinity.
fair, there might be some. There might be some people who respond to veganism and be like, I'm going to eat. Jordan Peterson eats exclusively beef. And that's what we're going to get. But I think on balance, it's more likely that the group of people who become radicalized for veganism eat less meat than the people who are radicalized for carnivorism eat more of the meat of. So on net, less meat consumption
I mean,
occurs.
it's more a question of like, they're less likely to be educated again. It's not necessarily like the consumption, it's just that the arguments are going to reach them even more.
Possibly. I think to a certain extent that's maybe a short-term consequence of this. I think once you're able to convince sort of a middle to move over, one, I think that is a net good, right? It's quite plausible that the consequence of any movement that wants to get people to reduce their consumption of animals is never going to be completely successful. So I think there's always going to be a group of people we never reach. Maybe that group gets a bit bigger because the ideology is more aggressive. But my suspicion is that the net number of people still ends up being more positive if we're willing to be more vocal about our opinions and our views. Is my take.
Yeah, I think we've got time for 2 more comments. So yeah.
This is kind of a general comment on none of you, I don't think any of you mentioned that like the defensiveness that people have to when they get told that, oh, it's what you are is morally wrong. It goes deeper than that in that eating meat has like cultural ties to it. Like take the Sunday roast for example, or any kind of culture where like carving meat is quite a like it's like a cultural event. Well, there's like emotional ties to eating meat. So it's like people's favorite dishes growing up, for example, all have meat in them. So it's just kind of like an extra layer to maybe why people don't want to be vegan, not considering like just being morally wrong.
Also, just like considering how we only had like 7 minutes each, a lot of our arguments were very Western centric, in the sense that like in the West, we can, in Edinburgh of all places, we can claim that veganism is very widespread and mainstream, and everyone knows, or at least accepts to some degree, the effects of the benefits of veganism and the effects of meat intake and stuff like that. But that certainly is not true in all cultures, and especially places where there is, as you said, such a strong tie to that traditional cuisine that like has meat and things like that. So I don't think it is as like obvious to different cultures and things like that, whether or not this trade-off is something that is. I have a question. Maybe just gonna grab from the back first. Sorry. You go. Sorry, she's one of us. It's okay. I can tell she's not. You go at the back.
There's a comment on one of the points made that poor people generally eat fast food more often. An article by the New York Times, which looked at Americans, to be fair, so sadly there would be somewhere here, found that about 32% of people who are less than 130% of the federal poverty line eat fast food daily, but 42% of people who are above the 250% of the poverty line consume fast food daily. So what do you think about this? Like saying that fast food is like the accessible option, whereas like things like Tesco and Sainsbury's are also widely accessible, and you can buy like really cheap food there. And if you say that the cheap food is not nutritious, do you think it's fair to hold like vegan food to a standard, like a really high standard of health when fast food is also up to that standard?
Yeah. So I think again, this like very much differs between like where you are. So if you're in a place like Edinburgh where you have Sainsbury's
business everywhere that widely carries vegan products, then of course like the accessibility is very different. But for a lot of people, vegan products do tend to be more expensive because of like the fact that they are less common, or the fact that they are not in like their common like chains of restaurants and things like that they typically go to, things like that. And so I don't really remember where I was going.
Yeah, like I think. Yeah, I think like the stats about like people engaging with like fast food and stuff. Like the example of fast food, I think, illustrates the point that like the accessibility. I think, yeah, obviously it's entirely possible to eat a pretty like cheap, like nutritious vegan diet, right? But I think like the accessibility of that to like actually a large number of people is relatively slim. Like, I think like in certain places, yes, that will be big and that will be accessible. But I think taking in like the majority of like, I think just on balance, it seems that like that isn't the likely option that a lot of people have. And yeah, I think even if that isn't the case, I'm sure you have the facts and the figures to argue with you there. I think the problems therein lie with like Mark said, like yeah, it's a problem with capitalism as always.
But I mean, like,
yeah,
things like bread and rice and beans and whatever, even if you argue that those aren't fully nutritious, is it fair to hold like a vegan diet to a high standard of nutrition when like the diet that involves fast food is not up to that standard?
I don't know if it's being held to like a different standard. What do you mean by being held to a different standard exactly?
Like, I suppose it's a bit about your point, like maybe like a really healthy diet and do a lot of fruits and vegetables and kind of nuts and seeds and stuff, which are more expensive than like very simple stuff like bread and rice and beans. And people say that you need all of those things, those more expensive things to be healthy, but they don't say that about non-vegan diets, even ones that rely on like fast food and stuff. Like nobody's looking at a Big Mac to see like what the saturated fat content is.
Save your reply for your summary.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Talk about capitalism.
And that was a particularly pressing comment. We can see that we should at the top. Are you on it?
Yeah.
That's okay, cool. That's what I was just checking. Want to give everyone their say. Awesome. Well, in that case, I think that brings us to the end of our floor debate. Thank you everyone for your comments. And I will invite the summary speaker from side proposition to give their speech. Here.
4 minutes, right? I think it's pretty clear what we prefer as our proposition. I think we prefer a vegan movement that undergoes significant structural change, to be more significantly anti-capitalist, to have a better sense of its interpersonal dynamics, how individuals interact with others. We want to sell it as a more compassionate thing rather than as a more oppositional thing. And we want to have a better focus on accessibility, that takes into account class, and cultural differences that may not allow people in the status quo to have access to the kind of positive veganism that we want. We think, as it stands, the vegan movement utterly fails to take into account those kind of considerations, and we think it should do so. And we think the harms that it accrues in not doing that are really significant, as we've stated. Responding to some of the stuff we've got from the audience, right? Yeah, thank you for your comments and questions, guys. This has been really interesting. Returning again to the branding stuff and the sort of celebrating the selling of vegan goods in supermarkets, I think this sort of plays into a lot of the problematic trend stuff that we brought you in our speeches, right? Because Dhruti told you that people recognise the health benefits, people recognise it's a really good, positive thing for an individual to take upon themselves as a lifestyle change. And I think this is, in a way, almost exactly the issue. Because when that consideration isn't taken into account, but we just value the sort of the diet, the individual benefits that people get in the West, in white middle class culture, I think we fail on a number of bases there. Look, there is really no truly ethical consumption under capitalism. At some point, the goods that you consume are going to be produced in a way that you can probably take issue with. Acknowledging that, the same thing with avocado and almonds in QI. There was a sub-segment on QI the other week
where they went through a load of like fruit and veg that weren't like technically vegan because they involved the unnatural like movement of like bees to restore them. I think that's like a fairly reasonable, like it's a fairly unreasonable like standard for veganism, right? Because I think at that point you just can't eat anything. But like recognize that maintaining that moral like absolute position will inevitably run you into consequences and inevitably run you into problematic ways that you deal with the way that you consume products, right? So I think that we just have to be like consistently considerate and consistently working on the like movement as it stands. It has to be iterative. We have to work the problems out as they go. I think at the point where the mainstream discourse values like the healthy lifestyle of your white middle class art over genuine sustainability, it is unlikely to change because that is the kind of trends that capitalism tends to. And we think at that point when the movement is unlikely to change within that framework, the movement has gone too far. We are very proud of this.
I invite that speaker for their speech and invite Mark to close the case for side opposition and indeed the debate as a whole. Here it is.
If the burden of the government side in this debate was just to identify there are problems with veganism, then it would be impossible for us to win the debate. I think their burden is to say that we ought to have a veganism that is, on the whole, a lot more moderate than the veganism that we have now. And I don't think they've stood behind that consistently in this debate. Because what they've told you is that they want a veganism that is more anti-capitalist, that is more critical of industries as industries. I think that stance is a stance that is further than the stance that occurs in the status quo. I don't think that's a stance that is more moderate. I think when you say, I want an industry which looks at capitalism in the face and says, capitalism, you are causing the destruction of the world, you are supporting an industry that kills millions of people, and the problem isn't just these specific industries, but rather the entire context of capitalism, you might be right. But you would be defending a version of veganism whose scope and remit is far wider than the scope and remit of the movement in the past. I think the more moderate version of the things they're saying is that we want to acknowledge the fact that the meat industry generally has consequences, and that we ought look to make things like veganism more accessible. But it's very unclear to me that that isn't the status quo of veganism that we have, because I think they're trying to paint vegans and veganism with a very broad brush and say that the vegan movement as a whole isn't pushing for alternatives that are more accessible. And the consequence of a veganism that is more active politically is that you push for more accessible vegan products in stores. But once it becomes more normal for people to become vegan, because vegans are more vocal and active, once you shift the Overton window of what is reasonable to believe about people's diets, the consequence of that is that health stores, even for people who live in more marginalized environments, are now much more likely to have alternatives that make that lifestyle more facilitative. So the consequence of them saying we want to take a stance where we say that where we criticize veganism for putting pressure on people to have to conform to a diet that they can't conform to in the status quo, is actually to limit the real choices of those individuals. Because a stance of veganism that is more aggressive is a stance that actually gets to people more accessible vegan choices, more accessible vegan options, because it makes veganism normal, because it moves into communities that are beyond the very small niche groupings that exist in the status quo. I think we're entirely right to point out that the consumption of meat and the consumption of dairy has a significance beyond habit, right? That, like, as was pointed out in the floor speeches, right? That has a cultural significance. People are attached to it for meaningful and reasonable reasons. But I think that has to be weighed against the fact that the consequences of that consumption are incredibly dire, both for humans and for animals. And just because a practice has cultural significance isn't a justification for us not criticizing that practice when it has substantial and outsized impacts on the way that both people and animals are able to live and survive. So I think it's entirely reasonable for us to criticize individuals who support those behaviors, even when they are attached to cultural significances, because we're highlighting to them the extent to which those actions are harmful for other people. Their claim on government is that there are other things, other products that are harmful. That it's not just meat, and it's not just dairy that has negative impacts on farmers in the developing world, that has negative impacts on the environment, which is absolutely correct. But opposing the consumption of those products as well is clearly not mutually exclusive with supporting a vegan diet aggressively. Saying you should not consume meat and should not consume dairy ever can be said in conjunction with the claim that other products which are also harmful for the environment, also harmful for people in the developing world, that those are products that we should neglect in addition to this. I don't think the veganism movement, as we have it in the status quo, needs to be mutually exclusive in that way. I don't think I've justified to you why the neglect of those other products necessarily follows from veganism as how we have it in the status quo. I think the neglect of those other products would exist on either side of the house. And for that reason, I'm proud to present an aggressive veganism that adopts a principled stance and is happy to say that we oppose this consumption in all its forms. Proud to oppose.
Thank you so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed the debate. I think Mark probably wants to tell you more about debating at Edinburgh, probably, so he can come do that.
Absolutely. I would love to do this entirely planned, stump speech. Excellent. Well, if you enjoyed this debate, we host a number of other debates throughout the year. We haven't put our event up, but we are going to have a debate on November 28th. So you should be looking out for that event to go up so that you can attend to that. We also very regularly host meetings where you can participate in competitive debates as well. We have on Mondays the lovely Nathanael, who's also been speaking beautifully here today, host meetings in Appleton Tower at 7 p.m. You should definitely come along. We'd love to have you there so you can participate in that and follow the society, get involved. We'd love to have you.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so before we came in, we had you indicate which side of the motion you were on. There were very few people on government side. Let's see if they've convinced any of you. If you support the government side of this motion, if you think veganism has gone too far, give us your hand. That is an increase.
Oh, that's an increase. That is
I think there's around
definitely
2 more of you.
increase.
Those of you who oppose the motion, I can't really claim that as victory. I'd love to claim this as victory, but it was basically the same as it was before. I'm glad we've changed none of your minds. Have a lovely evening. Are we doing this?
Yeah, let's do it.